We've been extrapolating and our best estimates for around Australia for councils and animal welfare agencies is about 6 cats for every 1,000 people in Australia enter shelters or pounds every year, and about 3.6 are killed for every 1,000 people, which translates to about 80,000 cats killed annually for a human population of 24 million. And looking at the cost for shelters and pounds to manage it, it's probably over $100 million a year just for cats alone, and that's not trap and kill with the feral programs, and I hear them talking about $40 million a year for the Kimberleys alone for those sorts of programs. So the question is really how best to respond to a situation that's responsible for so many cat deaths annually. And so I come up with 9 strategies that I think will help to save lives, and I'm happy to debate that. Now, if you were in the last session, you saw one of these graphs before, but if you weren't, how many weren't in the first session? Okay, so basically this shows this red line or orange line is shelter deaths, and this is intake. And the thing that is, and you see so many of these graphs and even more like this, where they absolutely, the death rate mirrors the intake. And so it's so critical that to decrease death rate, you have to decrease intake. And that's the most powerful. So my number one strategy is transparency. And if you look at transparency across Australia, of the welfare agencies, it's only the RSPCA and the Lost Dogs Home that have current annual data at a national and state level. For councils, Victoria is far the best because on each council website, so you have to go to 79 websites and trawl around. Sometimes their animal management plan's not so easy, but they've got it there. New South Wales, through the Department of Cabinet or Premier and Cabinet, they have collated statistics, so the total intake and reclaim, rehome and euthanased for council pounds, but you cannot find out individual pound data if they won't give it to you, which they mostly won't. For South Australia, on the Dog and Cat Management Board, there's collated statistics for welfare agencies and pounds, but you can't find individual data for pounds or welfare agencies, and there's no euthanasia statistics. And for Western Australia, Queensland, Northern Territory, ACT and Tasmania, there is no publicly available data. And so if they won't give it to you, which most won't easily, you have to use freedom from information to get it. So why do I think transparency would be the number one strategy? Well, how as a community do we know where we want to be if we don't actually know where we currently are or where we were? And how do we estimate the resources for where we want to be if we don't know where we are and where those resources need to be directed? And secondly, there's a lot of evidence of the power of people to get change and do things better. And so that is really a very powerful reason to have transparency as a number one strategy. So I think there should be mandated dog and cat management plans on every council website, which include key data and have uniform definitions. So intake, reclaim, rehome, transfers, euthanased, fostering care. For dogs, I think it should also say dangerous dogs, euthanased. What functions are outsourced and to whom? I think there need to be transparent, also mandated transparency for animal welfare agencies. They're using donations largely. There's some big ones still that have absolutely, you can get no data, particularly for cats. And centralised data at the state level, so you don't have to go to 79 websites and trawl around to see what's happening for the state. And one of the issues, of course, is double counting. So for Victoria, the councils might have that the Animal Welfare Agency is doing the work, but that data will also be with the Animal Welfare Agency. So that needs to be adjusted at the state level. So my number 2 strategy is mandated anti-discrimination laws against owned pets in rental or owned accommodation. And a quick trawl actually by one of the US speakers at the Getting to Zero conference said they've found only 10% of rentals in Australia allowed pets, which is a lot lower than in North America and certainly in Europe. And this was data that Corrine Albertson did for part of her PhD, which found that of adult cats that were being surrendered by owners to RSPCAs around Australia, and a lot of the data I'm going to show you in this presentation is from her thesis, and she looked at 191,000 cats coming into the RSPCAs around Australia over a 4-year period. And most of the reasons that cats were surrendered were actually related to the owner and not to the cat. And 36% of those were because they could not find pet-friendly accommodation. And so, lack of pet-friendly accommodation, when we looked at that accounted for 9,000 cats and about 2,000 kittens becoming homeless every year to the RSPCA. When we extrapolated that to the rest of Australia for councils and shelters, it's approximately probably 30 to 40,000 cats become homeless every year because of the rental situation in Australia. And half of those lose their life as a result. For dogs, it's probably only about 1 in 5 die, and it's a smaller number, but it's still very significant for dogs. So mandating against pet discrimination will save lives, and it'll save you money too in taking those animals in. My 3rd strategy is spay neuter. And this again is Corrine's data from her PhD, and she looked at the proportion of cats coming into shelters that were kittens. And more than half of them are actually kittens. And when we look at the adults versus kittens, adult cats, about nearly half and half are owned and stray, but if you look at kittens, about 40% are from an owned queen and about 60% are from stray queens. And so clearly strategies targeting owned cats are ineffective for that 60% of kittens and 50% of adults that are coming into your shelter. And various surveys in Australia show that over 90% of owned cats are desexed. There was a very interesting survey from Western Australia where they're looking at cats presented for discounted microchipping. And the interesting thing was that, yes, cats over 2 years of age, it was like 94 and 97% over a 2-year period were desexed, but for cats under 2 years of age, over the 2 years it was 29% and 49%. So less than half the cats are being desexed before 2 years of age. And so that's consistent with other data that shows 60 to 70% of cats are not sterilised before 6 to 12 months of age. And unfortunately, 12 to 20% have a litter before they're sterilised. So that's the issue. So we need to delay that spay delay for owned cats with the message that it's not good for the cat. It's not good for the kids to see the cycle of life, particularly when those kittens are 6 weeks old and go down to the shelter or pound and are euthanised. The cat's not too young, and you need to get around to it. And in fact, there haven't been a lot of studies done, but this one had looked at about 1,600 cats, and they found that desexing cats before 5 months of age resulted in better behaviour and better health for those cats than if you waited till after 5 months of age to desex them. If you are getting data on the postcodes that those animals are coming from, and I would strongly encourage you to do that so you know where your problem areas are, the question is, should we have mandated desexing as South Australia's just announced and as ACT has had for a number of years, or is it better to spend our resources on targeted desexing to areas of high intake and euthanasia? So if we look at mandated desexing, what's the evidence for that? ACT has had mandated desexing of all dogs and cats by 6 months of age. And when we did that Australia-wide survey with the RSPCA analysing the data from 191,000 cats, ACT actually had the lowest prevalence of desexing of kittens being admitted to shelters in the ACT of all states. Now, however, they had the second highest percentage of adult cats that were desexed. So 81% of cats that were of known desexed status were desexed. So it suggests, like the Western Australian study, owners do eventually comply, but it's often too late to prevent that litter of kittens. So if it was mandated, it would need to be by 4 months of age. And why? Well, cats can be pregnant by 4 months of age. And also it encourages veterinarians to say, you know, vaccinate, go and see Mary in 2 weeks' time and book the cat in for a spay. So as veterinarians, we don't ask owners, would you like to come back in 2 weeks' time to have the second vaccination? So it should be, it's better health, better behaviour for the cat. It should be vaccinate, see the receptionist on the way out and make an appointment in 2 weeks' time. Instead of, well, call us in about 2 months because that's when we'll desex her. The problem with that, and I know there's been a bit of an uproar in South Australia that they've just announced this desexing prior to sale, that most vets are not trained in early age desexing. And we're just doing a survey, another student's doing a survey at the moment of veterinary teaching staff in all schools in Australia and New Zealand, and more than 50% of veterinary teaching staff who are teaching desexing do not advocate it to the students. The other problem is that students have to have reasonably high level surgery desexing skills before they can do early age desexing, because they have to be quick enough that it doesn't sit on the table for an hour under anaesthesia. So usually they need another week of surgery training, and all the veterinary schools, like for example Queensland University is losing, the vet school alone is going to lose more than $6 million this year. So it costs money to provide students with another week of training. And so that's the dilemma. And I'm really encouraging that shelters, particularly because you have the opportunity, but pounds could also, if you've got that opportunity, to partner with veterinary schools to provide that training. But what about these stray kittens that are coming from owned queens? And Sarah's going to address this more, but in a Victorian study, 33% of phone respondents owned a cat, but 22% said they fed a cat, it wasn't their own and it wasn't their neighbours. And that's remarkably similar. The South Australian data showed 27%. In USA, it's between 21 and 25% of households feed a cat that's not their own. In Ireland, it was 11%, but the owned cat population was 11%. And I truly think that this behaviour has probably been around as long as cats have been on the fringes of where people are living. It's probably as old as prostitution and is going to be as hard to get rid of as prostitution. And that population of semi-owned cats has been estimated to be actually equal to 2/3 of the owned cat population. And only 20% was spay-neutered in this survey done in Victoria. In North America, the frequency of them being desexed is even lower. And so it's clear that probably 40 to 50% of cats and kittens coming into shelters are stray, unowned, but they've got some degree of socialisation. They're not feral. And I'd encourage you to stay for Sarah's talk because it's fascinating. But people who feed these cats but don't perceive they own them are a very significant source of cats and kittens. So strategies to prevent unwanted kittens from unowned queens. So for people who feed cats but don't take ownership, we need to get social marketing messages out there to change attitudes and behaviour. And there is a student at UQ who's working on that right now for her PhD. And the message has to be, if you're feeding the cat, desexing is really important. What they've shown in America that you also have to provide opportunities for that to happen. And if people don't perceive they own the cat, in America they won't spend more than $15 to $20 to have it desexed. So if you want them to take that behaviour and take some sort of ownership, you have to make it easy for them. And this again is data from Colleen Albertson's PhD, where we looked at intake of kittens across Australia. It was remarkably similar across the states. And you've got this start of this kitten tsunami where they're starting to come late spring, summer, and it goes right through till autumn. And so clearly this is where we need to have a desexing blitz through autumn to stop these kittens that were born here producing next season's kittens, because that's how it works for cats. So if you know the postcode of origin, and certainly the shelters do, and I think most pounds are collecting that information, then you can also look at targeted strategies. And low or no cost targeted strategies to areas that you know are contributing cats to your shelter, cats and kittens, to stop that last summer's kittens producing next summer's kittens. In USA, where they used a voucher system, and it wasn't just handing out vouchers, they made sure they followed up, they made appointments for them, they reminded them on a weekly basis if the appointment was a bit of a way out, they reminded them 24 hours beforehand to make sure these people could get transport in, they helped them with transport, but they showed it saved $1.5 million over 4 years. And for those people that weren't here, for dogs it works too. Blacktown, where they subsidised desexing by 50%, Deloitte's calculated that for every $100 they spend in the community subsidising desexing, the marketing of it saved them $200 in the pound. Now, it didn't work well for cats, and it was probably because the message was wrong. Fourth strategy, confining cats to the property. When we looked at that data from the RSPCA, of cats that were known to be desexed, those cats that were strays, 35% of them were desexed, whereas 42% of adult council strays were sterilised, suggesting there's more owned cats in this group. So many of them are likely owned wanderers, and the data shows from North America, most owned cats are within about 5 houses of where they are actually owned. And we know that owners don't look for a cat as quickly as they do for a lost dog. This was US data. The average time to call or visit an animal control agency was 1 day for dogs compared to 3 days for cats. And many people, the cat does wander off and it usually comes back, but sometimes it doesn't. And of course, the minimum holding period in most states in Australia is 3 days, and they can be euthanased by the time they go to look for them. So clearly, strategies to keep cats on people's property are needed to keep cats safe. Some Victorian councils have got these legislation, and there's all sorts of ways that they can be kept on your property, and the Victorian government has some great resources there. Keeping them totally confined in your house does keep them safe, provided they don't run out the door. But statistically, obesity is at higher incidence, and diabetes. And a study that looked at obese cats found that 5 out of 10 were dead after 4 years compared to 2 out of 10 lean cats. So obesity has health implications. And so having the cat more active is better. And obviously these physical fences are better because they stop cats coming in the property. These sorts of fencing or this sort of enclosure can cause psychological stress for the cat and really quite severe behavioural problems, particularly if they can't get out and escape from that. The electronic collars actually work very well for cats. But the disadvantage there is it doesn't stop other cats coming on the property. So physical fencing is the best. Strategy 5, identification. So 15% of cat owners lose their pet at least once in a 5-year period. 41% of lost cats that were actually reclaimed, the owner said it was indoor only, and therefore they didn't perceive that it needed identification. And data shows that 64% of owned cats are microchipped in Australia. But when we looked at stray cats coming into RSPCA, only 9% were microchipped, and that was fairly recent data. And 37% of those microchipped cats had problems with the data, 47% were registered to the previous owner, 29% all the phone numbers were incorrect or disconnected, and 14% were not registered to a database, even though it's compulsory to do that. And I'm sure if you're trying to track owners, you found similar statistics. But when you looked at the outcome for those cats, if they had a microchip and had no data problems, 61% of those were reclaimed, compared to 33% that had data problems and 5% that had no chip. There's no legal requirement for a previous owner or organisation to transfer ownership to a new owner, as far as I'm aware of, in Australia. So what are the solutions? Should it be mandated that the previous owner completes the change? Should it be like car ownership, where both parties complete the paperwork and the people obtaining the cat have the responsibility to submit it? Would it be effective? Well, probably for organisations and breeders, if the responsibility is on the previous owner, but probably not for other people. So what might be more effective? And I think a microchip awareness month where welfare agencies work with municipalities to have a lot of concerted advertising, and have volunteers and situations where people can go down to their local park. There's a microchip there where the microchipping, you can scan it, you can take your pet, you can see whether the details are up to date. Because many people don't know where to find the pet's number, because that paperwork's long since disappeared. And they don't even know which database it's registered with. So they need to have opportunities to have the data checked, the microchip data checked, to see whether it's up to date, and low-cost desexing. And we also need to publicise more details about how to update it. And Rick's just walked in here, is saying that what they're doing now is emailing people, is it, or SMSing? Emailing people to get their data up to date. So, it's really important, because there's no point in having a microchip there if it's not linked to any current data, and it wastes a hell of a lot of your time trying to find the people. So, strategy 6, sharing information with pound and shelter managers on best practice. And if you look at the data from shelters and pounds across Australia, some kill 80 to 95% of cats, some are down to 11-12%. And introducing a range of strategies to reduce intake and increase live release has a marked impact. Jacksonville Animal Control in Florida, and they used to receive about 34,000 animals, and they killed 23,000. Now, Jacksonville's a fairly low socioeconomic area, a fairly large black population. And that's not a bad kill rate when that actually includes dogs and cats. So if you look at, cats 65, 70% kill rate, dogs 30, 40%, that does average out about at that. They changed their name 10 years ago, a bit over 10 years ago now, to Jacksonville Animal Care and Protection, and they're currently killing 2,000 animals a year. And I presented this data this morning. We know that cat intake for Victorian councils, the average for Australia is about 7 cats, and some have less than that, but some have up to 23 cats per 1,000 residents, which creates quite a burden for you to then manage them. And euthanasia rates are from anything less than 20% up to over 95%. So sharing information on who's doing what great things that actually work. and its multiple strategies, when applied together, result in dramatically lower euthanasia. Working with community was the one thing that stood out of those pounds that really had excellent save rates. Working with fostering and transferring to rescue groups. This don't take in more animals than you can care for is getting a lot of support in USA, and I know you are constricted in many ways that you do have to take animals in, but there's capacity for care. But there are things that you can do to try and reduce your intake. So engaging people to find solutions for their pet instead of surrendering them, and particularly for these semi-owned stray cats. And Sarah's going to tell you, that these people can be probably influenced. Make it easier to adopt them. Don't have restrictions, and I think councils are probably less like this than some shelters, but you have to you can't adopt a cat unless you keep it indoors totally. You can't take a dog unless you've got six foot high fences, and that's all well and good, but how many people here have a dog and have 6 foot high fences? You can't take a puppy or kitten if you've got young kids. How many people here had a puppy or kitten when they were a young kid? And helping people keep their animals in their homes. And if you heard Todd Stosey talk from, I think, Santa Cruz County in the States, it was really inspiring. So he's a government, municipality, and they're very much about being in the community, helping people save problems, and recognising that most people who actually surrender an animal, 80% of them, if they could be helped to overcome those solutions, would prefer to keep it. And many of them are struggling in their lives and they need help. But rather than take the animal and then you've got to deal with it, and I heard just in a conversation out here, it cost us $500 to process every dog that isn't reclaimed. It costs you money. And he had a granny squad of volunteers. And when he found out, the fence was not fixed, he'd call in the granny squad and they'd help them fix the fence. And they'd get the dog off the chain by fixing the fence, and build a little kennel for it. And these people did love their animal. And again, to emphasise that the data shows that people on low socioeconomic income or low, don't have, they care for their animals. They have a higher bond than high socioeconomic people, but they don't have the same capacity to care for it. So Jacksonville have a food bank. They provide, out of every 6 weeks, they provide 4 weeks of food. And it may not be the same food every week that you get, so you might get Whiskett's 1 week and you might get Royal Canin, but it's all donated food. Recognising again, it's far better to keep these animals in their home for people who love them, rather than take them and say, you shouldn't have a pet because you don't have the money for it. That may, you can have that attitude, but it means you kill a lot of animals. Behaviour counselling, having lists of real estate agents who have pet-friendly accommodation, putting them in contact with affordable pet care. I know one of the pet stores that's opened in Australia is providing, they've got a veterinarian there and some vet nurses, and providing simple advice for behaviour that's free. So, just helping people there. And improving your advertising and marketing so that the animals that you've got, which are, that where you're rehoming them, that are desexed and they're microchipped, so that people know that that's a preferred source and they don't go and get an animal from Gumtree that ends up being pregnant and they've got litters of kittens that Gary's just told me about. You should be seen as a preferred source of animals, that you're giving, you're adopting out healthy animals that have got good behaviour and will make good pets. Now, this is a controversial part. Return to field. Now, we know that the adult stray cat population is quite a heterogeneous population, and some of them are just lost and abandoned cats where the people have moved on. Some of these are the semi-owned cats where people are providing them some level of care, usually food, and some of them are feral cats. And the data from North America shows that cats are 3 times more likely to disappear from households than dogs. 66% of lost cats found their way back to their home because they returned themselves to their home, and only 7% of lost cats were found via the people calling or visiting a shelter. And cats were 13 times more likely to return via non-shelter means than shelter means. And we know the data from Australia is that only 4.5% of cats are reclaimed from shelters and pounds in Australia. And most owned cats that have actually strayed from their property are within about 5 houses of their home. So is this solution? This is the solution. This was a dog that was trained to sniff out cats and kill them. So based on the cost of eradicating rabbits from Macquarie Island, the cost of eradicating cats from Australia probably would exceed $1.5 trillion, which exceeds our GDP. Clearly, it's unaffordable, and not only if we did that, we'd have to ban all pet cats as well, so it's not a great vote winner. And there's increasing data that shows that the money spent by councils, although it's very well intentioned, and trapping and killing is actually ineffective. Because most councils are currently killing between 2 and 5% of the population, but for population control you need to kill more than 50%. And there was a very interesting paper that's just been published last year in Tasmania where they looked at low-level culling of feral cats, and it actually increased cat numbers. And they postulated that it did that because they're removing the dominant cats from those areas and other cats are coming in. They're also, because you are decreasing the population density, you're providing more nutrition for reproduction. So the question is this the best way when it may not be not only ineffective, but making the situation worse and costing money? And there's also data that shows that in areas where there are introduced species, it may actually not be effective or beneficial for wildlife. So the example on Macquarie Island where they took out the cats and the rabbit population absolutely exploded, it caused much more erosion and environmental damage than when cats were there, and they had to go and take out the rabbits as well. And there was a study done from bushland around Sydney where they took out the cats, thinking that would help the bird life there, but it actually made the impact worse because it introduced rats, and they climb up the trees and raid the birds' nests. So the solution for cats is clearly, it's not a question about cats or no cats. We have to live with cats, and how best do we manage them in a humane way which protects wildlife? And I would argue that we need to identify where there are really high value areas of wildlife, and we fence those and we take out all introduced species. And that's the most cost-effective way of protecting the wildlife that we need to protect. And if you look at what's coming into shelters, in RSPCA shelters, only 10% of cats were feral, and most of those were killed. When we separated out adult council cats that were coming into RSPCAs, and 20% of those were feral. So that does suggest that there's a slightly higher rate. But most cats coming into shelters and pounds, 80 to 90% are not feral. So what if we only euthanised medically untreatable cats, which is less than probably 1% of stray cats, and we neutered them and returned them to within 300 metres of capture. And in North America, what they do is tip them and microchip them. And does it work? In San Jose shelter, over 4 years, it decreased cat and kitten intake by 29%. Euthanasia decreased from 70% to 23%. They had a save rate for stray and healthy cats of nearly 97%, which translated to over 10,000 cats. Euthanasia in the shelter from respiratory disease declined by 99%, and this was a really interesting statistic, dead cat pick-up off the streets declined by 20%. And at the time, there was no change in dog statistics. So, shelter neuter and return is clearly illegal in Australia because unowned cats are considered a pest and it's illegal to release them. Why? Because we're concerned about the effect on wildlife. But is it justified, and particularly in suburban areas where most of these cats are coming from? Because cats certainly can have a negative effect on wildlife. They can have a neutral effect and they can have a positive effect, depending on the wildlife that are there, depending on the location, and particularly depending on what other predators are there. From a welfare perspective, rounding them up and killing them because they're free living and may get sick at some other time in the future is not logical or evidence-based, because it's been shown that most have ideal body condition, and that's about as illogical as saying we should round up all our wildlife because at some time they might get sick in the future and need veterinary care. So, as far as I'm aware, there's been no study in urban Australia demonstrating a negative effect of cats on native wildlife populations. A Perth study investigated species diversity across 3 bushland sites, and for 10 years they either banned cats in one area or required cats to be kept overnight and to wear inside overnight and wear a bell during the day, and the other one you could do what you like with your cats. And they found that the numbers of the most abundant medium-sized mammals were similar across all sites. That was sort of the brush-tailed possums and the southern brown bandicoots. And this little hoppy thing, this Antechinus, which is highly susceptible to cat predation, was actually most common where you could do what you like with the cat. And the bushland there was slightly denser, and they concluded it's not cats, but it was density of bushland. In New York, they looked at density of domestic cats in a suburban native reserve and the small animal density and biodiversity, and there was no link between cat density and small animal abundance and biodiversity. Another Perth study where they looked at 57 sites and they looked at factors affecting passerine birds, such as magpies, and they found no link between cat density and bird density and diversity. But they did find a decrease in cat population, surprise, surprise, with increasing housing density and distance from bushland. I don't want to see that. And habitat destruction and degradation, they concluded, were the critical factors and not cats. We're doing a study at UQ, and I encourage you, if you could, put this on your websites. We're asking people, what do they see, owners of pet dogs and cats, what do they see their pets catch in the last 6 months? What did they catch? Cats, overwhelmingly, mice, followed by rats, followed by small lizards, followed by birds, and the birds were mostly common species like the noisy miners and pigeons. And that's consistent with the Macquarie Island data, where cats actually had a positive effect on wildlife because of other introduced predators. So what if we released cats? Well, there's 2 studies from UK and France showing that birds killed by cats were less healthy than birds flying into windows or to cars. And they concluded that cats are opportunist hunters and tend to remove the sick, the old, and the fallen out of the nest, and actually keep the remaining population healthier. And the Royal Society for Protection of Birds in the UK came out with a statement that said, despite the large numbers of birds killed, there's no scientific evidence that predation by cats in gardens is having any impact on bird populations UK-wide. It's likely that most of the birds killed by cats would have died anyway from other causes before the next breeding season. So cats are unlikely to have a major impact on populations. So what if we released cats? Is it justified killing cats when it may not have a beneficial effect on wildlife? And I've been asking around, are there councils who are interested in collaborating with a research project? Obviously we need to get government permission to look at the effect on native wildlife where cats are desexed and released rather than being killed, and look at the cost benefit to you. So trap, neuter and return is my 8th strategy. I am getting close to the end. Evidence that it works in Montana. They had a 36%. So this is identifying where areas where you've got high kitten and cat intake coming in of stray cats, going in, trapping, neutering and putting them back instead of killing them, and also based on the evidence that in Tasmania they found that if you killed them it actually increased the population. So 36% decline in cat intake, 87% decline in euthanasia, 84% decline in cat-related complaints. In Texas, 90% decline in cat-related complaints. Kentucky, 51% decline in cat intake in targeted areas compared to only a 20% decline in the entire service area. So we'll hold that for discussion, but the next one, we're getting to the end, is accessible and low-cost assistance with behaviour. Of adult cats, people said behaviour was the major contributing cause for 7% being relinquished. And I do think that keeping animals in their homes makes sense. And so if you can provide some behaviour counselling through your pounds, so every Tuesday night we have a volunteer comes down, pay, it's free, or you pay $10 and come with your behaviour problems and they'll help you. And I think that we need more TAFE courses and vet tech courses that really focus on training people who can help with animal behaviour so it's accessible and low cost. So I'm just going to finish up, Nell. So what if every pound an animal welfare agency was transparent in their performance? What if landlords couldn't ban pets except under exceptional circumstances? What if shelters and pounds redirected significantly more resources into subsidised spay-neuter programs that were targeted to areas generating unwanted kittens and cats, targeted to autumn and winter to stop the cat tsunami? They are supported by effective social marketing messages to overcome the behaviour of people feeding cats without neutering and overcome that spay delay. Didn't get round to it. Good for the cat. Every owned cat was confined to the property, and maybe it needs to be supported by legislation, Victoria, and subsidies or incentives. Owned cats were microchipped and the database had current contact details for nearly all owners. Pounds and shelters implemented best practice. Healthy adult cats unable to be rehomed are neutered and released to the same area. Free-living healthy cats in suburban areas are trapped, neutered and returned instead of being killed, and behaviour modification was easily accessible and affordable. I ask you, if we did all those things, would we kill as many cats and kittens?